I used to feel guilty like all the time. Guilt, I think, was my autoresponder emotion. I felt guilty about everything. I felt guilty about things that happened to people that I had no idea even happened to them. Somehow, some way, I would internalize this guilty feeling. Like it was always like, no matter what was going on around me, I always felt like, oh, what if I could have stopped that? Or what if I had something to do with that and, inadvertently, or what if I didn't even know? And some way, shape, or form, I would just internalize this feeling of guilt about something other people had experienced. I remember always feeling guilty, especially as a child. And I think most of us, those of us that are empaths, those of us that are energetically sensitive, I think we have all experienced some level of abuse, right? Whether it was emotional or physical abuse. We had some type of abuse perpetrated on our body, in our lives, in our reality. And I think what happens with that, or I think probably the biggest change for me, was understanding that the reason I could never change that guilt, the reason that I always internalized that guilt, was because when things were done to me, when someone did something bad to me, okay, I would, instead of perceiving it from my own personal point of view, I would perceive it from the way that they were experiencing it. So if someone abused me in some way, shape, or form, and they felt guilty, I would internalize that guilt as the emotion that I was supposed to be feeling when that happened to me. So I started to live in a reality where when things happened to me, I felt guilty about that. When things happened around me, I felt guilty about that. When things, happened to other people that I knew, I felt guilty about that. Because somewhere I had crossed this weird line of internalizing perpetrators' feelings instead of my own. And what that created for me was really, truly more guilt, right? Because what happens is whenever you're in an energy, so let's take guilt, and I can identify this, especially as a very young age, I, experiencing a lot of abuse and from a lot of different people, right? People even from outside my family. What that brought to me was whenever I seen anything or even TV shows, I would internalize what was going on with that show as my own emotion. Like I can remember being young, watching the Cosby Show, right? And I know that probably you grew up on the Cosby Show as well. And I can remember when I used to watch the Cosby Show, how very guilty I felt the whole time I would watch that show. And then I would be done with that show and I would just feel so guilty, and I just really could never understand why I felt so bad when I watched that show. And eventually I stopped watching that show because it always made me feel so guilty. Well then, growing up and, years later finding out, what we found out about Bill Cosby, it was like, okay, no wonder that I felt guilty when I watched that show, because what I was doing was I was perceiving Bill Cosby's guilt. I was perceiving probably a lot of those actors on that show who was internalizing Bill Cosby's guilt, right? Because they were getting abuse perpetrated on them, and then they were perceiving Bill Cosby's guilt. They were internalizing that as their own emotion. Isn't it weird how when we are abused, especially sexually abused, and instead of feeling like a victim, we feel we feel more guilty or more bad that happened, or we feel guilty that happened to us, instead of understanding that the guilt that we're feeling is actually coming from the person who perpetrated the abuse. We don't have any reason to feel guilty for being abused. It's like such an oxymoron how we internalize the feelings of others instead of actually having that introspective point of view of what we should be experiencing. We experiencing it from other people's points of views, which is, I think, as an empath, as an energetically sensitive person, that's really truly what ties us up more than anything else. Is because the thing is you can't change a feeling that doesn't belong to you. So when I think about, okay, so why am I always feeling so guilty? Okay, well, number one, the guilt I feel in my body is imposed guilt. It's not truly my guilt, right? But because I have internalized it as my own for so long, and I have over and over and over identified it with it being my own guilt, then when I go to, try to change it, I can't change it because it wasn't mine to begin with. It never was my guilt. It was imposed guilt that I felt from somebody else, from abuse that was perpetrated on my own body. Then again, I had all these experiences all around me that continued to ignite that same guilty feeling, right? So all of a sudden, my whole energetic field was just this big field of guilty feelings that none of which belonged to me. But every time I was around anyone, every time I ever experienced something or heard someone telling me an experience that they had, and it had guilt in there somewhere, it ignited my guilt field, made me feel guilty internally. And over and over and over, I identified with that feeling, making it my own, wondering why I couldn't change that. When in all actuality, it didn't have anything to do with me, which is exactly why I could never change it. Take a nice deep breath. Whereas everywhere that you are identifying with someone else's feeling that doesn't belong to you, and you're wondering why you can't change it, take a nice deep breath and just allow yourself to be aware of that for a moment. All of that information is not yours, doesn't belong to you. It just really, truly, it's time to change that.